What the hell is long COVID? Chapter 4. Under the Hood. How COVID works. So you've had COVID. You're done, right? Let's give a little hypothetical here. Most people know what rabies is, the foaming at the mouth thing that killed old Yeller after he got bit. Now, let's imagine something. Let's say you and I are out hiking, down doing the hiking thing, and suddenly a skunk jumps out and starts, hint hint, rabidly gnawing on my leg. In self-defense, I whack the skunk and we sit down to assess the damage. You are impeccably prepared and you happen to have brought along a rabies test kit. Sure enough, the skunk that was gnawing on me had rabies. Bad news. We rush back to the front country. You drop me off at home, urging me to get a rabies treatment immediately. But you call me the next morning. How's your skunk bite? Have you taken care of the rabies? Meh, I respond. No biggie. I had a slight fever last night, but it's just a flesh wound. I'll be healed up in a day or two. My natural immunity is crushing this infection. You'd be horrified. Do you even know what rabies is? You might scream at me. Clearly, if I'm telling you how I beat rabies because I got over the flesh wound, obviously I don't really understand how rabies works. Allowing for some hyperbole here, that's kind of what it's like explaining long COVID and the long-term effects of COVID to people who don't have it. Yeah, I had a fever and I was achy for a few days, but it's all gone now. No, it isn't. It just simply isn't. Again, this is a carefully refined, lab-designed bioweapon. Do you really think that the engineers of this thing forgot, to take into account the human immune system? Doubtful. Now, maybe you're not sold still that this is a bioweapon, but bear with me because either way I can assure you, once you lift the hood and understand the attack mechanism of COVID, you'll at least be slightly less confident when you say, I beat COVID. Here's a bold claim. Aside from the vast majority, 10 to 20% of the population maybe, including those who had early treatment, the sooner the better, and children, for various reasons I won't get into, I would argue that almost no one who has been infected with COVID got off without any long COVID. Oh yes, they don't realize it, but that's really the whole point. That's the design of this bioweapon. Those of us that do realize it, because it whacked us in the face, only realize it because we happen to have particular vulnerabilities that expedited the process that is happening in almost everyone. What's my basis for arguing this? My basis for arguing this is that, at least to some meaningful extent, I understand how COVID works. So read on, and then, once you understand how it works, decide whether you got off without any long-term effects of COVID. That being said, it's just my hot take. Take it or leave it. Only time will tell. Either way, once you understand how this predator preys, you'll understand why I say just because symptoms are gone doesn't mean you've beat COVID. Just a heads up, for this work, I'm going to do my best to keep things quick and descriptive. My goal here is not to delve into the innumerable nuances and technical particulars so much as it is to help equip you to heal and to detox. Trust me, you could write a long and boring book on any one of these elements. So without further ado, let's lift the hood on this devilish little disaster, the COVID virus. The anatomically correct COVID virus images you've all seen have about 25 to 60 arm-like molecular structures sticking out of it, and a bunch of dots all over its surface. These arm-like things that are sticking out are the spike protein, and the dots on the surface are various other proteins that compose the virus. There are essentially two main avenues of attack for COVID, as I mentioned. Again, I say two, but you could divide it up further. Let's stick with two for the sake of simplicity. The first is the spike protein. The second is the immunogenic attack that precipitates autoimmunity. Most people who have delved into COVID even a little bit have heard about the spike protein and its dastardly deeds. The autoimmune or immunogenic mechanism, however, is almost never talked about, likely because we know next to nothing about autoimmunity to begin with. Spike protein. Let's start with a spike protein. The S1 spike protein, those little arms you see popping out of the virus, works by latching onto your body's ACE2 cellular receptors. Now, as a footnote, it's important to note that while ACE receptors, that SARS-CoV-1 attached to, are everywhere, ACE2 receptors, that SARS-CoV-2 attached to, are found in lung tissue and capillaries, hence especially in vital organs, especially in the extremities of those vital organs, and especially in the brain. We'll get to exactly why later, but this is a huge piece of the puzzle. So, again, SARS-CoV-2, COVID, spike protein, works by latching on to these ACE2 cellular receptors. These spike proteins cause enormous damage and are incredibly hard to eliminate once they've frosted your system. Let me explain how it works. When COVID, the actual active virion, infects you, it replicates like crazy. Every time it replicates, each new viral copy has 25 to 60 spike proteins dangling on the outside, just like you see in the pictures. That spike protein is what helps the COVID virus latch onto your cells and infiltrate it for replication. Note that the COVID virus also can replicate other ways and attach to other receptors, but for now, let's concentrate on ACE2 receptors. However, once the virus infiltrates your cell, the spike protein are left behind, free-floating off into your system to do what they were designed to do, raise Cain. But you might be thinking, won't my immune system gobble up these nasty little thugs before they get anywhere? Bad news. See, Spike's got a little trick up its sleeve, almost like it was designed this way. Like some weird molecular corn dog, Spike is wrapped in a blanket of sugars to hide it from your immune system and generally make it very difficult for the body to break it down. This is called glycosylation. Glycoproteins are common, but not the amped-up glycocoating that you'll find in swathing COVID Spike. COVID Spike is different than your average glycosylation. COVID Spike sugar coating is so heavy that it has a special name called a glycan shield. Just what it sounds like, shielding it from you. Only 4 other viruses that we know of have the functional equivalent of this glycan shield, and you might recognize at least 2 of them. Influenza hemagglutinin, paramyoxyvirus F, HIV, and Ebola. How strange. Once the spike float off, they find ACE2 receptors and glob and stay, causing inflammation as well as a sludgy drag onto your blood flow. As if that's not enough, spike even start to tango with your blood cells via a malaria-like mechanism, cell receptor CD147, and cause strange, unnatural microblood clots that bypass the natural sequence required for a blood clot. As you can imagine, after a full-blast COVID infection with zillions of viral replications, you get a lot of spike clouding your cells, especially in vital areas crowded with ACE2 receptors, the most important areas. But hang in there, friend, I have more bad news. If and when your immune system finally does gobble up COVID Spike, well, Spike has another nasty swindle waiting for you. Your immune system munches up dead cells and debris with a special immune cell called a monocyte. Since monocytes are your body's janitors, so to speak, they're given an all-access pass to essentially every part of your body, including being allowed past the blood-brain barrier. When a monocyte scarfs up spike, that spike isn't neutralized. Instead, as the monocyte shuttles its spike around, it irritates the blood vessels that it passes through, causing inflammation. If the inflammation gets bad enough, your monocyte then transforms into a stationary blob called a macrophage, which in turn signals your body to cause extra inflammation. Not only that, but now these spike are there for a long time. Dr. Bruce Patterson and his team have found them lodged in victims even as long as 15 months following a wild COVID infection. So, to summarize, spike equals bad. Spike cause nasty, fixed inflammation to vital areas, areas in which your body would do anything to avoid inflammation. Spike also sludges, so to speak, your blood flow, preventing necessary oxygen and nutrients from efficiently reaching your tissues. In a big way, as we'll see in a moment, and we'll understand why that's a big deal shortly. Now, just to be clear, Spike has other bad stuff that it does, but I don't have space to get into that. This alone should be bad news. But it gets worse. Much worse. Amyloids. COVID's viral engineers built a fun little surprise party into the spike. When the spike is sliced in a just so way, it degrades into something that is something like out of a horror movie. Enter the amyloid. Quick footnote, yes, both wild COVID spike and the COVID spike generated from the mRNA shot have the amyloidogenic sequences talked about here. Now, if you've never heard of amyloids, you can be forgiven. They're bizarre, obscure, and worst of all, there's no officially known cure for them. Yes, in case you're wondering, now is a good time to cue the creepy music. You may have never heard of amyloids, but I'll bet you've heard of some of the diseases amyloids cause. Rheumatoid arthritis, Alzheimer's disease, Crohn's disease, leprosy, Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, tuberculosis, to name a few of the more well-known ones. That's not a happy list. Here's what an amyloid is. Your body makes proteins by folding them into certain functional shapes. When they're folded correctly, they do what they're supposed to do in your body and help you. When they're folded incorrectly, however, big problems happen fast. Usually, your body will do a quality control check and destroy the misfolded protein right away. However, there are certain scenarios where your body can't undo these misfolded proteins, and the misfolded proteins begin to multiply and clump together with your body's clotting material, fibrin, and in the worst case, with a structural strength similar to steel. And yes, bad news, Spike's amyloids are the worst case, called beta amyloids. These little jerks skip your normal blood clotting process and began to form nasty fibrin clots that are essentially indestructible. Note that mainstream medicine will tell you there's no way to destroy them, but yes, I am personally doing my best to destroy them. We'll get to that. In other words, when Spike breaks down, it was designed to inevitably form horrific, virtually indestructible clots in every part of your body, especially in your vital organs. And yes, that includes your brain. If you thought spike clogging sounded bad, welcome to the whole new horrific world of amyloid fibrin clots. As with all these attacks, you won't feel any of this. Nor is it likely to show up on the usual clot tests, e.g. D-dimer, etc. These tests don't technically measure clots. They measure a substance that occurs when the clots break down. Since the amyloid clots aren't breaking down anytime soon, your D-dimers will come back whistling a merry tune, perfectly normal. Sneaky, or what? In short, you won't feel any of this. While you're congratulating yourself on your macho immunity, Spike, like a creep at the gas station, is just hanging out, waiting to detonate into amyloids. Think again about that list of amyloid-caused diseases. What's one thing you might notice that they have in common? They all happen silently, wreaking irreversible damage over a long period of time. Nobody wakes up and says, "Hey, look at that, I have tuberculosis today. Better get on that before it gets bad." Nope. You figure it out only after it gets bad. Real bad. All of these are well known to be stealthy and usually very, very difficult to diagnose. By the time you figure out what damage the amyloids has caused, you've already been chewed up and spit out. Immunogenic, autoimmune. Meanwhile, Spike has a pal that's just as caustic and churlish. Immunogenic proteins that cause your body's powerful immune system to attack itself. COVID has nearly 40 different proteins built into the virus. All but 7 are human immunogenic, meaning that they are proteins that are naturally found in humans, aka you. So what's the big deal? COVID was built with human protein building blocks. So what? Well, think about this. When COVID first infects you, your immune system detects that it's no bueno and latches onto it with a certain type of immune cell, a T cell. This T cell runs back to the other cells and says, hey, this is the bad guy that I found, and this is what he looks like. Glob onto him and destroy him like a YouTube clickbait title. Your immune system then fires up special cells, B cells, that quickly produce a blizzard of antibodies that attack the structure that the T cell provided. How they attack is crucial. They glob on to the offending virus, the antigen, and essentially prevent it from interacting with anything around it. Gross, but think of them like a bunch of little slugs that slurp onto the offending virus. Eventually, once enough of these little slugs cover that thing, it'll be unable to breathe, smell, hear, talk, etc. It'll get completely clogged and immobilized, and a monocyte will swoop in, chomp, chomp. But there's one not-so-small problem. Depending on just how the dice rolled, the information that the T cell provided to the B cell will result in an antibody that is programmed to attack human protein, your tissue. It sounds like a weird horror movie, but it's not a horror movie, it's you. And there's a very high chance that this happened to you, whether you realize it or not. So suddenly you have a proliferation of antibodies that are attacking COVID and attacking you. But what part of you? And how? And why don't you feel them? And can't you just go to the docs and get tested? Yep, you've got this type of autoantibody. Let's start by taking a look at what part of you it attacks. I made this handy and horrific chart of the immunogenic protein proportions that this bioweapon is designed against. The following percentage are the percentage of human proteins found in COVID. 19% ubiquitous proteins, that is, proteins found everywhere. 12% plasma cell proteins. 12% brain. 12% B cell immune system. 7% lung. 7% GI tract. 4% kidney. 4% blood. 3% eye. 3% liver. 3% skeletal cells. 3% placenta. 3% bone marrow RNA immune system, 1% spleen, 1% adipose tissue, body fat, 1% thyroid, 1% pituitary gland, 1% bone marrow, 1% epididymis, that is, testicle tissue. Now, you might be asking, the biggest category is ubiquitous. Wouldn't that be autoimmune that attacks everything? Well, two things. First, that's the biggest, but maybe not the most noteworthy category. The most noteworthy category is the attack on the immune system itself, the B cell category and the bone marrow RNA category. From the get-go, this autoimmune ambush is directed against your immune system. The best defense is a good offense, I guess. Apparently, COVID paid a lot of attention in virus school. But secondly, yes, ubiquitous here indicates that the immunogenic protein is found everywhere in you, and that's crucial. Why? To be sure, these autoantibodies are to a limited extent directly attacking the tissue that they correspond to, the liver, the GI tract, kidney, etc. But more importantly, they're doing something else, clogging up the blood flow. Because these autoantibodies have a specific strategy they're deploying against you, clogging. Think about what I mentioned above and how these antibodies work. They glob onto the thing that they've been programmed to attack and clog it up. They're supposed to clog up the bad guys, but now they're clogging you. Specifically, the tiniest capillaries that deliver goodies to the most fine-tuned areas of your vital organs. Notice the second category, plasma cells. That's blood cells, by the way. In other words, you've got a cloud of these little slugs glooping onto your ubiquitous tissues everywhere, including the walls of your tiny, tiny microscopic capillaries that blood is only barely eking through, and meanwhile they're glooping onto the blood cells that are trying to flow through these micro blood vessels. Call a microscopic plumber because you've got some nasty clogs, my friend. Think about what that means. Essentially, all at once, all throughout your body, you've got tissue everywhere, brain, heart, lung, thyroid, that isn't getting adequate oxygen and nutrients. Oh, it's getting some, enough for you to not feel much of anything. But it's like an extra nasty version of high blood pressure. You're not going to drop dead in 15 minutes, but this is really, really, really hard on your body, especially in vital areas. Think vital organs, which of course would be the last areas your body would ever let become oxygen-starved, were it not forced to do so by this bioweapon. And remember, this is all happening in conjunction with things like the spike protein poisoning described earlier. You have the big ugly thugs, the spike, and the precision assassins, the autoantibodies, both silently asphyxiating your innards. All the while, you might just feel nothing. Maybe a headache, maybe a little extra tired, because it's not preventing blood from getting to these areas. It's just really, really slowing it down. Truly diabolical. If this were a one-and-done thing, no worries, whatever. But it's not. Likely, even for people who don't feel anything, this will last a long time. Months. Years. I've taken to calling it a specific term, COVID hypoxia. In other words, the most sensitive and fragile areas of your body will be clogged, stifling the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to them, asphyxiated to some degree in their function in slow motion over months and perhaps years. If your vital organs are running their recuperation marathon with one leg, competing against the usual seasonal infections, life and job stress, and a myriad of other pressures, well, gee whiz, where on earth did that cancer come from? That arrhythmia? That hypothyroid? Etc. Ultimately, it came from a bioweapon, my friend. One quick footnote that is not in the original book. Since the publishing, I've had a chance to delve a little bit into COVID hypoxia, and some of the research is fascinating. You feel oxygen deprived not from oxygen deprivation per se, but from an elevation of CO2. COVID's hypoxia, however, is designed such that even though you are oxygen deprived, your CO2 does not become elevated, and thus you don't feel anything. Medical personnel that I've come across describing this phenomena have been so shocked as to describe COVID hypoxia patients as having oxygen low enough to be incompatible with life, and yet feel absolutely nothing. But on to the next question I mentioned above. Probably the most annoying, at least to the ailing long COVID victim who certainly does feel the effects. Can't you just go to the docs and test for this? Nope. I wish it was that easy. You see, we basically know jack squat about autoimmune diseases. Very, very little. We can test for certain specific autoantibodies that are more commonly found, e.g. celiac disease autoantibodies, but without high-level laboratory access, and even then, there's very little that we can detect when it comes to autoimmune diseases. For example, the autoimmune disease lupus, SLE, is diagnosed with a loosey-goosey criteria, where if you have any 4 of 11 specified symptoms, then you have lupus. Not to bust out too technical of language, but it basically just means rashy autoimmune disease. Super duper pooper scooper precise. The lupus guy and the IBS guy obviously talked to each other. But more seriously, we simply don't know much about this arena. You might have an elevated ANA. You might not. You might have a high CRP, something odd with the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, etc., etc. Or you might not. We simply don't have the tools that give us much insight other than clunky approximation into the autoimmune world. But once you understand what this bioweapon is supposed to do, you don't really need to nail down exactly what it did to you specifically. You can be virtually certain it did what it was designed to do, namely trigger an autoimmune response, and unless you're a child, had early treatment, or apparently lucky, your vital tissue is quite possibly gasping for air and nutrients, and you don't even know it. But even once you do know it, what can you do about it? I know. Get to the punchline. What do you do about it? But I can't get to the punchline just yet. There's some corollary or secondary attacks that need to be explained before we can circle back how to block this thing. 3 attacks, actually. These secondary attacks are generally what people label long COVID, i.e., these are the things that COVID's primary attacks described above precipitate, and that are tangibly felt by people like me, wretchedly, for months on end. Sustained immune response. The first of these attacks is how COVID tricks your immune system into never shutting off. In the previous chapter, I mentioned in passing the old man who bumped his head, and his body rushed to calm down subsequent inflammation, and presumably it went away in a few days. But not COVID's microinflammation. Oh no. COVID does something to keep the immune system that tells it, hey, immune system, never shut off. Keep up that nasty inflammation even after the viral infection goes away. This could be due to any number of mechanisms. It could be because COVID incorporates HIV sequences into the virus, and somehow that does something to play games with your immune system. It could also be the spike macrophage dynamic previously described, namely macrophages bristling with spikes settling in, causing inflammation. More inflammation they cause, the more they think they have to stick around and signal even more inflammation, and so on. A vicious cycle. It could also be the amyloid fibrin clots. One of the symptoms of amyloidosis is perpetually swollen lymph nodes. It could be something else, just the endothelial blood flow clogging that's going on, causing your system to freak out. Who knows? What we do know is that your immune system thinks it can't stop the immune response, even though the viral infection is long gone. And it can sustain that inflammatory response for months. Again, you'd know it. Trust me, if this is happening to you, you'd be trashed for months on end. Ask me how I know. But I mention this because it's an important component here. You very well may need to manually, so to speak, shut off your immune system's response. Quick footnote, this is where it gets tricky. Who knows why or how or what to do about this? I can guarantee you if you go to your doctor and say, Doc, I have a long COVID sustained immune response and I need to manually shut it down, he'll assign you to the nether regions of the charts. Instead, maybe try, hey Doc, I've heard low-dose naltrexone has helped people like me. Can I give that a shot? Or something like that. LDN seemed to do the trick for me in this regard. Very magical chemical surgery. Third-party virus condition activation. Little did you know there's a monster under your bed, waiting for COVID to wreck you, then helping COVID eat you. Okay, but basically, yeah, approximately 90% of people, for example, have EBV, aka mono, and when a person's immune system gets hammered, the EBV comes out like a werewolf in the full moon. It was EBV for me, but it could be anything else too. MCAST, histamine sensitivity, fibromyalgia, your age-old gallbladder problem, blah blah blah. Quick footnote, I did take spironolactone for this, and I'm glad I did. It doesn't eliminate mono, but I don't care. I just needed to beat it down. I'll fight it later. But whatever it is, COVID's going to exacerbate it, and potentially let something else out of its cage. And now you know why. Because things are maniacally clogged up. And your vital organs have been struggling, slowly asphyxiated, fighting with one hand tied behind their back. Cellular metabolism disruption. Here's where it's handy to remember that COVID is a bioweapon. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet. There were a few researchers early on who were going around insisting that this was the cause of long COVID. Yes, it is. It's one of the causes that contribute. But unlike an actual natural virus, where you could usually pin something down, this is a bioweapon. It's designed to attack you with a multi-pronged attack and make sure that the job gets done, not something elegant and straightforward like you'd find in nature. This COVID thing is ugly, tacked together, almost more biomachine than biological. Anyone who drops a bioweapon like a hot track remix isn't going to risk wasting their time. Anyways, I wax eloquent. But the scoop on this, if your cellular metabolism is disrupted, it takes about 90 days to get it back on track. An active COVID infection can, and very likely did if you have long COVID, disrupt your cellular metabolism. That means that if you can start taking care of this within 90 days, you're in luck. After that, it's probably not going to be quite as helpful. Although, let's be real, you're not going to be completely up to snuff after 90 days if you've gotten trashed by long COVID. This will probably still help. Basically, the secret ingredient here is niacin, not the flush-free stuff. You'll want to supplement that to help overcome this attack. We'll cover the what next here in a moment, but it's important to have this piece of the puzzle here as well. Chapter Appendix: Natural Immunity. Let me quickly digress and give my thoughts on how natural immunity relates to all this, now that you solidly understand some of COVID's attack avenues. Here's why I think it's counterproductive to be running around tooting the natural immunity horn. In short, we know this came from a lab, and that it's targeting humans. Do we honestly think that a bioweapon engineer is going to waste their time with something that everybody's natural immunity can kick around? No. So let me give you the bullet points. Number 1, natural immunity isn't going to protect you from one or more separately tweaked bioweapons, if that were happening in theory, specifically designed to bypass your immunity. Number 2, natural immunity can even be hijacked to work against you to make subsequent infections even worse, e.g. go read up on dengue fever. Number 3, if subsequent lab-tweaked variants are emerging and you're infected by them, you're getting slammed with a barbarian horde of new spike and autoantibodies. Simply beating the immediate symptoms of acute COVID doesn't mean you've beaten COVID, and the effect compounds with each case. Number 4, most of all, now that you know how COVID works, even in the case where the variant were actually natural, simply because you have natural immunity doesn't mean that you don't get a subsequent infection. It does mean that you quickly fight that infection, but you still got infected, and you still got a dump truck of spike unloaded into you. Far less than you would have, but still plenty. And if you're already getting thrashed by long COVID, or anything else for that matter, even a light load is not good. Quick footnote, I just recently got another case of COVID around Easter 2022, almost certainly a natural variant. It was much lighter, and thank God I was prepared this time, but it absolutely set me back, even though it was just a light infection. But even if you're not in an all-out firefight with long COVID, up to you, but from where I'm standing, this does nasty things to you on the sly. So let's stop talking about natural immunity and instead talk about a bioweapon response. I'm 100% sure that any bioweapon engineer has remembered that humans have natural immunity. Gee, whoops, forgot about that. Not likely. For me, hearing people trumpet natural immunity here is like shaking my head watching my toddler figure out with swag and aplomb how to undo his diapers. It's not going to end well, I promise. Lest it be thought that this is me riding around on my high and mighty horse, that natural immunity guy was me in 2021. Natural immunity is not the primary answer against a lab-contrived bioweapon, any more than your natural immunity is the primary answer to getting hit by a bullet or a knife.